let's do a compare and contrast, shall we? In the wake of my playing Banish All Their Fears, specifically the Battle of Blenheim, I wanted to just do a quick kind of side-by-side of the components and talk a little bit about the differences and the similarities between Banish All Their Fears, the system here, as it's expressed in the Battle of Blenheim, and the Battle of Blenheim 1704 from Legion War Games and Steve Pohl, which is part of the 7-hex system. I think it's a really interesting comparison. As you know, I did a playthrough of this game late last year that kind of kickstarted some of the discussions around games in the 18th century, and we just completed a playthrough of Blenheim here. If you haven't watched those, it will be helpful for you to watch those to at least get a sense of what I think of both games before watching this video, although you could watch this standalone if you're just interested in kind of how two games about Blenheim are expressed. So let's move these to the side. I want to talk about how these two games kind of like relate to each other or are similar or different in certain ways. So I've got the maps here laid out. This is Blenheim from Banish All Their Fears. And as we saw in my playthrough, you can see that the Unterglau is on fire. Here we have got the map for Blenheim 1704 from Legion. And at first glance, they are pretty similar. If I move this over here, we can have a look. So here's the left, the eastern flank, the left, it was the Allied left, and the village of Blenheim. We've got the Nebel north of it, and we've got Schwenningen up here. We've got the same thing here. We got the village of Blenheim. We've got the Nebel, and the village of Schwenningen is actually not on here. And I'll explain why that is in a moment. But we're talking about scale between these two games. Every hex on this map is 180 to about 200 yards, or meters, excuse me, 180, 200 meters. Every area, these like sort of shapes here, is 500 meters. So we're talking about 175, maybe a little bit less meters per hex. So the hex scale is actually almost exactly the same. What's interesting is that here in Banish All Their Fears, the town of Blenheim has a much more expanded footprint than the town of Blenheim here. We're talking 2, 4, 6, 8, almost 1,000 meters north to south here, whereas here it is a simple 175 meter hex. Now, part of that is because of the game system here. The terrain in the center indicates benefits for the surrounding hexes. So we get a little bit bigger of a scale of a footprint of the urban areas in the Banish All Their Fears map. Now, the one thing I should note about the projection, as we know, and I've talked about this, the projection of the Banish All Their Fears map is actually skewed. And I was looking at the two. You can see we've got Schwenenbach, and this is Wolfperstetten. They are at the very northern edge of the map there, almost directly kind of above Oberglauheim and Unterglauheim here. On this map, we have got Wolfperstetten to the northwest of Unterglau. So that would mean if we were looking at this map, it would be like in this area here. Why is that? Because this map is distorted, and the way that it's distorted would be if you basically drew a line right down this red here and then cut the map and then shifted this entire thing up and to the right. So imagine rotating this third of the map around like this. That would put these villages up here into their correct locations. That would actually move Schwenningen a little bit to this side, I believe. And it would have Lützingen come up here and be in line with Oberglau and Blenheim. And that is what you see on this map here. So you can see it's a straight line across Blenheim to Oberglauheim to Lützingen over here. The reason they did that was to fit it on one map, allegedly, although given that we have a map here that is one map and almost the same scale, I do think they could have probably managed to do this. I guess maybe they would have been able to capture the extreme flanks of the battlefield given how big their hexes are. Because while the hexes are the same scale, they are slightly bigger in Banish All Their Fears than the hexes in Blenheim 1704. Now, one of the other things I mentioned in my playthrough, or excuse me, in my review, my initial impressions, not a review, is the far western edge of the map. So if we look at this and we find Lützingen here, that is the same as this town here. And again, we have a bigger footprint to the town as compared to Blenheim 1704. But you'll see that actually the terrain to the west of Lützingen here is actually elevated. There's some difficult, what do they call it? This is called the Alterberg. We've got woods, Jungholz, Goldberg. So we've got this road that runs west out of Lutzingen, which is this road here, even though it's actually, it might be this road here, because since we moved this up, this road would actually be probably, I think, this road. So Lutzingen here, the point is it's flanked by rough terrain. In Banish All Their Fears, I made a mention that there's no elevation changes on the map, and that it's just woods here to the west. Lots of woods, as you can see. On the Blenheim 1704 map, Lutzingen has some clear space around it before you get into like these highlands. And then you've got scattered patches of woods along this terrain here. Now, I don't know which one is more correct, but I do find it interesting that we are dealing with elevation changes in Blenheim 1704 and not in Banish All Their Fears. Now, let's talk a little bit about what these games are both trying to accomplish. They're both trying to simulate the Battle of Blenheim, and they do it in so completely different ways, and they still manage to sort of accomplish the same thing. So in the 7-hex system, unit scale is the brigade. So the unit scale of, let's see if I can get these out of here. The unit scale, I'm just going to use a couple French units here, that's an example, are brigades. So these brigades would represent anywhere between 2 and 5 battalions. You've got the combat value here, and you've got the stacking value here. Now in Blenheim 1704, you cannot have more, I believe, than 3 or 6 stacking points in sort of an area. So you're at most, you're allowed 2 brigades in a given area. Now, in the 7-hex system, units can be in the center, meaning they're ready to march and they're in sort of a maneuver formation, or they can be in these border hexes here, and these are going to be in a more combat, defensive focused orientation, and they protect attacks from the areas that they're touching. So attacks from here and here and here would be defended by these brigades. Compare that to Banish All Their Fears. We have the command unit being a brigade, so it's going to be the same size unit, but we have those brigades broken down into their constituent battalions. And there is a maximum of 2 battalions per hex. So what we get is a little bit of an interesting scale distortion here. You've got potentially upwards of, what would this be? You know, it could be anywhere between like 6 and 10 to 12 battalions operating in sort of a 500 meter sort of like area. That would be the equivalent of like 3 hexes. So you would have, 3 hexes in all directions. So 1, 2, 3, kind of like in this, you would have potentially 12 battalions. I think they're probably equitable. I do think Blenheim 1704 is abstracting the spatial and density a little bit because it's a brigade size unit. But the games are actually far more similar than what their pieces and alignment would have you believe. The victory conditions in Blenheim 1704, you have to do a specific number of casualties to win an auto victory. That is very similar to routing an entire wing in Banish All Their Fears. And so both games are concerned with the casualty level and the casualty limit that an army can tolerate in this particular engagement. Additionally, terrain... the terrain is more important in this game. As you can see, we've got these hexes that have a sort of like preventative march across. This is the marshy ground. I do think that Blenheim 1704 is a little bit more restrictive when it comes to the swampy nature around the Nebel, which is this stream here and this stream here. In Banish All Their Fears, you actually don't have any marshy ground around the Nebel. And the way that that's simulated is that battalions crossing the Nebel have to stop unless a causeway on the Allied side had been built and placed there. Here, not only does it limit your movement because you can't go through these hexes, but again, we're talking about a system where you're moving center hex to center hex, so I could move from Unterglauheim here. But it does reduce the stacking ability of brigades coming into these areas. You're not allowed to have, I think, if more than half of the hexes are impassable terrain here, you're not allowed to have more than 1 brigade. So you're limited on the number of battalions that can get across. It functionally... kind of represents the same thing, that it's difficult to cross the swampy ground, but there's no spatial limitation other than stacking in Banish All Their Fears. There's a spatial limitation here because of the way that like launching an attack is from area to area. So you kind of, that sort of zoomed out, like this is a full brigade and not individual battalions. You get limited and bottlenecked in here when you're trying to make attacks across. The Blenheim 1704 actually allows the French to get right up against the Nebel. This game does too in an alternate setup, but attacking across here I don't think is allowed, or if it is, it's severely punished. And because the unit scale on this is zoomed out a little bit, it's brigades, it doesn't quite give you the granularity of like the difficult crossing and then the combat around the river. It just makes it very hard for the Allies to achieve what they did historically, which was an attack, which is an advance across the Nebel and then an attack. A lot of the French units set up like right along the creek, and when you try and attack, you're at very bad odds. So it makes it difficult in Blenheim 1704 to achieve the historical outcome, which is sort of a drive through the center, because you're limited by stacking and then consequently limited by how much attack power you can bring to bear across the Nebel. Versus in Banish All Their Fears, you are able to move across and it doesn't really affect you unless you're cavalry, and then you can fight in combat. And so you're able to get the more historical, like get the Allies across, make a line, get some supporting units up, and then have the combat on the Hochstadt plain. When I played Blenheim 1704, it was very difficult to dislodge the French from these areas when they were defending. I had way more success around the village of Blenheim, and we had that too in Banish All Their Fears. I should mention there is also a swampy area to the east of Blenheim here that is kind of represented by this area in Blenheim 1704, but you can see you can actually surround the town without any ill effect with some of these clear areas. So it's a slightly different take on sort of what was happening on the battlefield and where. I think that Banish All Their Fears hews more closely to the historical capabilities that the troops had, even if the terrain here may be more accurate. Although I think there is some thing to say that Marlborough's scouts said that the marshy terrain was not, it was actually overblown, and that's why the Allies lined up along this river, because while the French thought that they couldn't be moved through, the Allies had some scouts that said it could. It wasn't that bad. It also blunted the artillery impact. Artillery, both sides have artillery in the game. It actually functions very similar. You can cause hits, well, you can cause disorder, which are kind of like step losses in this game. So brigades, when they're disordered, get flipped over and then they become combat ineffective until they're returned to combat effectiveness. Very similar to Banish All Their Fears. It's based on range and cone of fire in both games. And artillery is not that effective. It's hard to hit, and it's hard to hit unless you're really close. So distance, firepower, that is really similar between the two games, and I think it's interesting that they both came up with a similar model. Linear warfare. In Blenheim 1704, you are rewarded for having units in attacking position surrounding a targeted, or at least flanking a targeted area. If you think of the area as the representations of the linear formations, you want to outflank your opponent, surround them with your formations to get them to get combat advantages. In Banish All Their Fears, it is similar because open flanks when you're combating units. So let's say, you know, these are both French, but let's say we had something like this. This unit is defending against this unit. It's got a covered flank here. This one has two open flanks. Or, you know, if it was stacked, the stacked unit covers a flank and whatnot. So the flanking bonus here is on a unit by unit basis, not a brigade by brigade basis, but here it's more about a geographical positioning of your brigade. So it's a little bit more zoomed out, like I said. In general, Blenheim 1704 is more zoomed out. There is a command system in Blenheim 1704 that is based around leadership. Both games actually both emphasize the importance of leaders. In Banish All Their Fears, it's about the brigade display and using your leaders to give orders to your units to change their posture and formation, for the lack of a better term, between three different orders and then get them refreshed and back into the fight. It is about moving your reserves and support lines into better positions so that they can be effective in combat, or relieving brigades that have been suffering. And that is all enabled by your commanders. The better your commander, the more likely it is you're going to be able to achieve those goals and respond to battlefield conditions quicker than your opponent. In Blenheim 1704, leadership also incredibly important. Not as many leaders as Banish All Their Fears, but Blenheim 1704, the leaders are arguably more important to the actual gameplay, because when you activate in this game, you can only activate units that are in or adjacent to where you have a leader. And because you're going to have units all spread out along the front of the battlefield, you're not going to be able to activate your entire army every turn. So the leadership positioning is really important. Now, critically in Blenheim 1704, your leaders, because they facilitate your movement and positioning, they have to be in the right spot during that phase of the turn. However, leaders don't get to move until the very end of the turn. So you're constantly thinking one turn ahead in Blenheim 1704, where you've got to have your leader move at the end of a turn to enable your following turn's attack plans. And in that way, it really models well sort of the Marlborough effect, which is like he was all over the place. He was able to see the battlefield. He was able to plan ahead faster than the French, and he was able to get troops where they needed to be. It is critical in this game that your leaders are in the right spot. Otherwise, you're going to have suffer a very big stall in your attack. Here, leaders are important for maneuvering your brigades and getting them to the right spot so that when they fight, they can fight effectively. And changing their posture, basically. So both games recognize the fact that leadership is extremely important to the operational tempo, or the tactical tempo, let's call it, to the battle. And they go about it in very similar ways because your leaders move around and affect things that are around them or next to them. They do that in the same way in the brigade display here and banish all their fears. And so I think that the modeling here, while different mechanically, is actually the most similar of all of the stuff between these two games. And I thought that was quite interesting that both games recognized that in this period, warfare, victory on the battlefield and in warfare was determined by the quality of your leader. Is there anything else I want to talk about? We talked about the map, we talked about the units, we talked about the scale. I will say, I think that despite this, me saying that Banish All Their Fears was very limited in terms of its the maneuver element of the game, Blenheim 1704 is even more restrictive because it takes a long time to get your units moving where you want to go. That is very similar here, but it's different in the sense that your unit posture, your brigade posture, really depends on what hex they're in. Are they taking up a more defensive posture in lines forward to defend against attacks? Are they going to be in the center so that they can move different areas and then attack from those areas? So that is one area, that is one part of the game that is much different, is that the maneuver here I felt was more restrictive because when you look at it, it looks like there's a lot of space between the units, like if they're spread out like this, right? But technically these guys are adjacent on the map, which would be like the equivalent of something like this, right? This equals that, even though we're talking about different scale of units. So it's a little bit harder. The abstraction here is a little bit harder to wrap your head around than Banish All Their Fears, which is a much more typical hex encounter game, although in some ways it's not. The variable end to a turn in Blenheim 1704 puts a time pressure on the game. That is true here too. There is a specific turn end hour. And so both games are basically like, can you plan and execute quicker than your opponent? Can those decision cycles be more rapid and more efficient than your opponent? It's just that here it's less predictable. Here you know that every turn is 20 minutes and you're going to get to do all the things that you're allowed to do in those 20 minutes. The whole army is eventually going to get to have their go based on the order that the units have. Here it's based on a variable die roll, and the turns are 30 minutes and you don't know if you're going to be able to do everything with your army. And in fact, when I played Blenheim 1704, I did feel like the timer was pretty aggressive. You are really, as the attacker, as the allies, up against the clock quite a bit. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Blenheim 1704 talks about the glanders outbreak in the French, one wing of the French army. You're not allowed to mix those units over here with the rest of the Bavarian French armies. In Banish All Their Fears, the designer, David Fox, says that the glanders outbreak he thinks is overblown and that it didn't actually have an effect, and therefore in the Battle of Blenheim and Banish All Their Fears, there is no, you don't have to be worried about the glanders with the horses, with the cavalry of the French right wing. So who knows how accurate all of that is, but different views from the authors. The other thing I should mention as well is that battalion guns are reflected differently. So as we saw in Banish All Their Fears, battalion guns are distinct counters that are stacked with a unit and then are used for a one-time artillery bombardment. In Blenheim 1704, battalion guns are actually going to be on a specific unit. Now, you can see we actually have two brigades here. This one doesn't have battalion guns, but this one does have battalion guns, that little icon there. That provides a bonus in combat, and you get to use it every single time this unit fights in combat, versus in Banish All Their Fears, the battalion guns are basically one and done. The combat system between the two games couldn't be more different. Here we're looking at a CRT that has a few modifiers and takes into account the flanks and the types of units fighting each other. You roll a die and you get some range of results. That can result in sort of a firefight stalemate. That can result in retreats, in combat losses. Units can rout as a whole brigade. In Blenheim 1704, it is a die roll modifier system where you are calculating all of you're basically adding the strength points of all the units that you have in an attack together. You're looking at a bunch of different conditions about flanking, whether you have presence in areas around your target more than they have. Are you more supported in the attack than they are? Then you're going to roll your dice, and then you're going to cut that number in half, and then you're going to do a certain amount of hits based on that. And it's a pretty non-intuitive mathematical formula to do hits. You will disrupt brigades before you destroy them, and disrupted brigades can then be removed. Casualties are a lot lower in this game, but in both games, the brigade is going to be the command and control element that is eliminated when a unit is eliminated. Here, it's just represented by a single counter. Here, you can have a battalion route, and then the rest of the brigade routes with it. So it's a little bit more unpredictable. I would say that this falls way more on the deterministic side. Even though you're rolling dice, it is generally... you can get a good attack, and that attack will probably go well for you if you can engineer it. Here, it's a little bit more of a roll of the dice, no pun intended, where the combat results have a wide range, and you can get some very unexpected results, such as the British attack on the village of Blenheim in my playthrough, where, against all odds, an entire brigade managed to force the French back out of the front portions of the town, even though they should not have had any business doing that. So, I think either one is going to be kind of a acquired taste, depending on what you like in your games. I did find Blenheim 1704s to be a little bit needlessly convoluted and hard to remember, but it is only die roll modifiers. Whereas here, you've got to think about all the different possible results you can have and what position your units are in, and whether or not they're attacking the right target. There's a strict priority about how units can attack in this game. Versus here, you can attack from one area, then another area, then another area, and as long as you continue to have orders and the turn doesn't end, you can keep attacking. In fact, there's bonuses for attacking an area more than once in a given turn. With all that being said, that's just a quick little analysis of both of them. Which one would I recommend? Well, here's what I would say. The playtime of Blenheim 1704 is half or less that of probably Banish All Their Fears Battle of Blenheim. You do get 2 games in this box, so if the War of the League of Augsburg or the late 17th century is of interest to you, you may get more historical value out of this, and we know that there's going to be more volumes in this series, so you can learn the system and have future games to potentially look forward to. Blenheim 1704 is a standalone. It is only the Battle of Blenheim, but it only does play in a couple of hours. It is probably much more new player friendly, although I wouldn't call it a war game good for new wargamers, but it is much more playable. You can get this played in kind of one sitting, whereas I think Blenheim is kind of a half to full day affair if you're going to play through it. I really like the map art of Blenheim 1704. I think this is the loveliest map that Legion Wargames has ever done, and I actually prefer the Blenheim map, both because of the projection, but also because of the artwork to the map here, although this is a good map as well. I have no complaints about the map in Banish All Their Fears. I think that Banish All Their Fears is a much better historical representation of what this type of warfare looked like, and also the command decisions that go into it. Blenheim 1704, definitely not trying to be a simulation, more of a game than a simulation, although a game with a lot of historical value. Now, I will say that the 7-hex system, there are plans for other games in this system, but as of yet, they have not reached their pre-order number at Legion Wargames. There's one set in the Napoleonic era, and there's one set in the Great Northern War, which is the same time period, but different armies. So there is potentially more to look forward to. I just think they both occupy different spaces in the wargame space. This one I would play in an afternoon with a friend, even if they're not interested in the history. This one I would only play with someone who is interested in the history and who liked crunchy games. So make your choice based on my opinion if you want, or try them both. You can get this one pretty cheaply. This one I think is now out of stock at GMT. However, it should still be easily findable on the secondary market. Either way, I want to express my support for more games in this era, especially War of Spanish Succession. I applaud both designers for their vision about what they have tried to do to reflect the realities on the ground in tactical combat with both of these games. And I think they go about actually viewing the battle and the period in the exact same way. They just express it so differently. So yeah, there you go. That's a quick look. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you've played both of these games or one of these games, I would love to hear what you think, and whether or not you have any interest in checking out the other one. I think Blenheim, I need to play more, and I have a friend who's interested in playing it, and I would like to get it to the table more because I think it's a game that rewards multiple plays. As I do Banish All Their Fears, it's just the length of play and the complexity of the system is a little bit of a heavier lift, so I just see it not being played as often. But either way, I like both of them. I'm going to keep both of them in my collection, and I thank you for watching.